everybody. This is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the show where I get to sit down with other writers. And I've been doing this for many episodes now and for a few years. And even though it's a lot of work, even though it costs a lot of money to have this professionally done, and even though sometimes it's tough to fit into my schedule, the moment I sit down and I start having a conversation with these authors, something in me just like, okay, I could do this for a couple hours. You're fascinating. I want to hear all about your life. So it's always interesting. And today's guest was certainly no exception. Before I get to her, I just want to mention I have a few spots still left open at my writing retreat and coaching program this August 9th through 11th in a gorgeous Boulder, Colorado. So the Gentle Novelist Writing Retreat. I am so excited for this, and it's really, it's really geared to aspiring writers, struggling writers, or even established writers who are just looking for that spark, that motivation, that accountability, and community. So if you want to know more, please just head on over to my website, carterwilson.com, and just click on the link for retreats, and you can read all about it. So today on the show, I had Eliza Knight, who is a very prolific USA Today best-selling author, and she's written all sorts of different things. Tried her hand at thrillers early on, but really kind of made her bones in historical romance and historical fiction as well. She loves to research. And her upcoming book, when is it coming out? Let me see right here. It's coming out June 6th. So hopefully this episode will be out by then. So the book is now out, I'm going to officially say. It's called Starring Adele Astaire. And it's all about Adele Astaire, the sister of Fred Astaire, who actually has arguably a way more interesting life than Fred Astaire. And it looks fascinating. She goes into a lot of detail in our conversation about what was so particularly interesting about Adele Astaire that caught Eliza's attention and wanted to write an entire novel about that. So really good stuff. She's written so much that, starting from a place of like, I don't know anything about the publishing industry, I just like to write books, to someone who now has more or less mastered how the industry works, which is no small feat. So as you can imagine, during our conversation, she imparts a lot of good advice through just talking about her own personal writer's journey. So I think you're going to like this one. I love talking to her. This is my conversation with Eliza Knight.
Hi, how are you? Sorry.
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
You're in your little cubby there.
Yeah.
Like a place where you do your work.
Yes. My desk is actually in the center of the room, so there's stuff on the other side. I have a treadmill over there and a whiteboard and everything, but this is like, I hide in the corner.
How very feng shui of you.
Right.
Is that where you do a lot of your writing, or are you kind of like anywhere, anytime?
All of it is done here. I try to use my laptop like when I go out of town, or sometimes occasionally like go to a library or a Starbucks or something, but I find it too distracting. I just like to be in my little space with silence and that. It's funny how you get into that habit of like, okay, and everything's a trigger for that habit over time. And I found over, I've been writing for about 22 years or so. And I find over time, like maybe I'll shift, like, because there was a time where I was writing in Starbucks, put the headphones on, but now it's in I have a little cubby off my master bedroom, and 5 o'clock at night, I do that for an hour. And so, but you get so ingrained that it is kind of hard to write other places. It's true. I used to be the same way. I used to only write on a laptop, and I would sort of take it to like the couch or the dining room table or outside. And once I got into the habit of being into my office, and it just stuck. And now I find it very difficult to do anything outside here.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny because I preach all the time to aspiring writers. I'm like, dude, you got to write from anywhere. You got to write in your car, like kids are at soccer practice.
Yep.
And now I'm like, God, that sounds terrible.
How do we do that? I don't know. I a couple of years ago tried doing that at some practices, and it just wasn't working. So now I usually just bring a notebook or a book and read or something like that.
there is a warm-up process that you have to, and this is also what I preach, is I always say, don't wait for the muse, right? Every day.
Right.
But for me, I do need to like sit for a few minutes. I need to not quite meditate, but really think about what I'm going to do and just kind of let the world dissolve a little bit around me. And that is a harder thing to do if you're surrounded by chaos.
Absolutely true.
Obviously. So where are you? Where are you located? I saw on your website you're like on a mountain or something like that.
Yeah. So I'm in Maryland, and it's a really small mountain. I think it's actually called a ridge.
Oh, okay.
It's like the highest point of ground between Baltimore and Hagerstown in Maryland is what they say. But yeah, it's called Mount Airy.
So what can you see from up there?
Nothing. I live in a neighborhood, so like houses. Down the hill, I can see like a little reservoir where we take walks, which is nice.
But it sounds peaceful.
It is. It's really peaceful.
Are you from that area?
I'm not from this town, but I did grow up in Maryland. I was born in D.C. I grew up in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and I went to college at University of Maryland.
Oh, wow.
So
you're
pretty much.
Just all your family's there and stuff like that. And so I'm always curious, like growing up in that area, were you, what kind of child were you? What kind of child were you that ultimately manifested itself into doing what you do now?
So I was the kid that my parents were like, please go play outside. Stop reading so much.
You were the nerd.
I was the nerd. And then when I would go outside, I did enjoy like riding my bike and rollerblading, but I would always do it like through these like wooded pathways that we had in this big park. And I would just be like imagining things the whole time anyway.
Where do you think your love of reading came from?
I think definitely my dad. He was always a huge reader. And in fact, when I was in high school, he would give me the books that he was reading because we have similar tastes, like thrillers and historicals. So that was probably where I got a lot of my start.
Yeah. And if that naturally mixes with a creative imagination, then, I can see how, they kind of feed off of each other over time. And I was kind of just the opposite. I mean, I was always an imaginative kid, but I did not like reading. I was never into reading until living on my own in my 20s. Then I'm like, oh, books are interesting. But I always think like, man, there were no phones back then, smartphones. There was no internet really. And
no.
I'm like, I wonder if I ever would have become a writer had I had all those distractions at kind of that age where you were ripe for choosing different paths,
I think so. Like, I feel like a lot of times it's sort of in us anyway. I think about, I have 3 daughters, and one of them, she's, was born with internet already existing, and she was a huge reader, and now she's also a writer, getting her degree in creative writing right now. So I think there's that. But then, of course, like my middle daughter hated books. I always thought, well, is she even mine? Like, I remember like birthing her, but I don't know. She hates books. Right. And she didn't really start reading till she was like 16 or 17. And then my youngest one isn't really a reader at all, but she's a huge writer. So I think it's just part of you.
Obviously a familial influence there as well. Although I don't have that. Like my kids could give a shit about, like, my daughter's a reader, and much more voracious until maybe she turned 14, and then she's like, oh, boys.
Right.
My son,
boys, Instagram.
My son has managed to get through 30 pages of the book I fucking dedicated to him. But that was an accomplishment. And he's like, no, it's really good. I'm like, yeah, clearly it must be great. Like, you mean, 30?
It's a life goal of his. He's going to finish it by the end of his life.
Right. And I might be the cause of the end of his life if he doesn't finish it. So what did you, when you were going off to college, what were your leanings?
So I actually started college as a journalism major, and I did journalism for almost 2 years and then called it quits because I was, first of all, I had kept trying to like embellish a lot of my articles that I was writing in the class, and my teachers continuously said, you can't do that, stick to the facts, short, concise sentences. But I like writing longer sentences, and I like to add things and detail that wasn't necessary. And then I was taking this obit class, and that was the final straw for me. I had been writing these beautiful obituaries for these people, and my teacher was like, you can't write them like that. It's supposed to be very short, concise. And I was like, yes, but don't you think their family would like to read about their life in this beautiful way that I've done this and telling a story? And she was like, no. And there's only so much word space in a newspaper. So,
Right. I didn't know there was such thing as an obit class. That's fascinating.
yes, a whole semester writing obituaries. Can you believe it?
Wow.
And so it wasn't even so much like the death part. That doesn't bother me. It was the not being able to write great stories.
Right. So, but I'm sure, I mean, I find journalism majors fascinating because I think journalism majors who ultimately become novelists, there must be something in there where, I mean, learning how to write concisely is so critical, especially if you're writing like I do, like thrillers, like, you know, the pace is so important. And
Yeah.
as much as you like to kind of write longer sentences, I'm sure your 2 years of journalism experience still has helped you understand, okay, this is good, this needs to go.
Yes, it really has. And I think it also helped me like hone skills for research and sort of diving down different pathways to get information, because I write historicals. So I do have to have like a lot of information and facts. And also it helps me figure out what of those facts to keep and what to sort of toss, the same sort of thing.
Right.
So I think it definitely helped.
So then what did you shift to?
So I originally asked my parents, who were paying for my schooling, if I could switch to English, because I really wanted to work either writing for magazines or novels or work in publishing, something like that. And of course, my parents said, no way, you need to get a degree that will allow you to have a real job that pays your own bills.
Your parents are very smart.
They are right.
I just said, that's the best advice you could have gotten.
Right? So then at the time I was taking an elective class in family studies. And I thought, well, that's a fun class. It's like psychology, sociology, and dynamics of the family. So maybe I'll just switch to a family studies degree and become a therapist or something like that. And I can keep writing on the side, which is what I ended up doing. And I think that also helped. So I had 2 years of writing in college, and then 2 years of figuring out how people's brains work and relationships and families and stuff like that. So all of my schooling combined actually did help me and does help me daily in my career right now, which is great.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And even just learning how to write in whatever, it could be technical writing,
Right.
is a very difficult skill, right? Like
Mhm.
even in the business world, I'm always amazed like how many people in their 30s who really can't write anything well,
Like even an email.
especially an email, like,
Right.
you know, and so and I remember when I first started learning to write, you know, even like I used to be a real estate consultant, and I used to do these appraisal reports, and I'm in my early 20s, and just, I'm like, I don't know how to put two sentences together. It sounds clunky, it sounds sloppy, and it just takes so much time so getting the leg up on it in school is huge, because I don't think I had to write anything in college. I was a hotel major.
No papers.
No papers.
Wow.
Yeah, no, I didn't take any English classes. I didn't take any lit classes.
Lucky.
No. Yeah. So then you get out of school, and then what do you start doing?
So at first I was a behavioral therapist for autistic children. And then I ended up working with adults who had disabilities that were trying to get back into the workforce. So I did a lot of resume writing actually at that point. And then coaching them while they were at work, and being sort of an intermediary between the employee and the employer, which was a lot of fun. And on the side, I was writing books and giving them to friends and family just for fun. And at one point, I was kind of getting burned out. That line of work takes a lot of hours, and it's very draining. So I thought, well, you know what? I'll give my hand at writing and see what happens, because that's what I really wanted to do to begin with. And that was in 2006. And then my first book was published in 2008.
Well, let's go back a little bit, because your throwaway comment of I was writing books for fun on the side, like yes, you always wanted to write, but that transition from that that passion that you harbor and the actual act of writing a book, there's a massive chasm between those two things, right? And very few people ever kind of make that leap and can actually write the book, regardless of their passion.
Mhm.
What was your experience doing that with your first book?
Well, I had been writing for a really long time. So when I was in second grade, I basically like self-published my own book called The Mouse Who Stole the Cheese.
Oh,
Made, the cardboard cover and the construction paper glued to it, passed it
nice.
around. And then in third grade, I had a short story published in a charity anthology.
Hmm.
And I used to write continuations of my favorite novels that I would give to my friends as
So
well.
like fan fiction.
Yeah, fan
Yeah.
fiction.
Mhm.
And I did that through high school and college. And sometimes, so for fun, I would say, I came home from work and I would just sit down on my computer and start writing. And every day, maybe write a chapter or a scene or something like that. And it was just like a hobby.
But did you have a fleshed out story in your head, or you're just like, I'll just do
Yeah,
see this?
it was totally pantsing it,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
see where it would go. I didn't
Mhm.
really know much about outlining novels until I really
Either.
started like in 2006 to actually dig in. I was like, this is really hard. I don't know what I'm doing.
Right.
Like, I know how to write, but
I've never outlined in my life, so
right?
Right.
Yeah. So I started taking classes and I joined some different writing organizations and I was entering contests and being given back different, feedback and stuff on my writing and figuring out like, oh, wait, the character has to have a goal, a motivation, and a conflict. What are you talking about?
Yeah, yeah.
So
But I
it's
mean,
been a
like,
crash course.
yeah, and I'm always curious about that because I kind of went through a little bit of a similar thing where I started writing out of the blue, and with no business doing it. So you obviously want to gravitate towards like, how do I do this? But I quickly realized, like with classes and books on writing, I got really repelled by this is the way you do it.
Yeah.
You quickly realize like, well, no, and when you start thinking about, you just mentioned it, the motivations, the character arc, and all that stuff, it's very easy to get caught up in that and get confused, as opposed to just having the instinct of like, well, it's not interesting unless there's conflict. So something should happen
Right.
in this scene, and let's see where it goes. As opposed to thinking like, okay, the precipitating act has to happen by page 35, whatever. Did you find yourself, and also with the fact that you're writing fan fiction, you're kind of writing in other voices, did you
Right.
find yourself gravitating towards like a certain voice or a certain type of book that you were writing?
So when I first started out, I actually started writing a thriller and I got sort of obliterated in a contest, which like looking back, I should have just taken that and dusted it off and moved on. But it sort of like killed my motivation to write in that genre.
This was a whole novel.
Yeah. And so then I started writing historical romance, which I've always enjoyed as well. And that sort of, I guess, had a talent for that. So that was what my first book was published in. But I also enjoyed historical fiction. So I started dabbling in that as well in 2011, I believe. And that was sort of like a catalyst for where I am right now as well. But I think that, I don't know, like I still have, I think, a little bit of like the thriller I like brain, I guess, because all of my historical romances have always had suspense in them, every one of them. There's some sort of villain, there's some sort of thing they're fighting against. So I think that's maybe sort of what I gravitate towards. And in addition to history, like I'm history obsessed.
So you like the research aspect of it.
I love the research aspect, and then I love the suspense aspect of like not knowing what's going to happen next and like sort of having to solve a problem.
Right. Well, and it's funny because, a lot of writers sit down and like, this is the story that I want to tell. I don't know how you want to classify it, but this is an interesting story to me. Then the publisher says, well, this is, historical romance. And
Right.
okay. But then all of a sudden that comes with it a lot of obligations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they expect certain things like, hey, this is too thrillery to be a romance. Can you take some of that out? Like, I was just telling the story that I thought was interesting.
Right. This is the story.
Right. So I find genres very very tricky to define.
Yes. And there's like certain beats you have to hit. Like, okay, they need to meet for the first time by chapter 3. And, you know, then you have to have like some sort of like tension going on when they're looking at each other. And then, you know, you have like all these different things that you have to hit in different places in the book that sort of even readers expect. I have a series that is about the Jacobite War in Scotland in the 1700s. And my heroines are based on real rebels during that time period. So they're doing a lot of like, you know, spying and fighting and things like that. And it was really supposed to be more like a bridge between historical fiction and historical romance. So I wasn't hitting the beats properly, you know, like
the romance
the first time till page 200 because it wasn't about that.
Right.
And I had a lot of people complain because it wasn't like solely like the romance. Yeah.
Right. And well, then that's the other problem, right? Is as you write enough novels, you get to a point you're like, you know, I want to do something different or whatever. And then it does become problematic because they're like, well, this isn't a typical novel for you. I'm like, well, I know. And you also want to do something original. You don't want to feel like, sure, the readers are expecting certain beats.
Yeah.
Do I really want to write something that's exactly like everything else, even if it makes the readers happy?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a little bit taxing and a little, because you have to have joy in what you do, or otherwise it totally shows, I think.
Right. I think so too.
So what was your process getting that first book published?
Oh man. I had a lot of different friends read it, giving me some different advice on, you know, characterization, setting, and things like that. And I actually entered it into a few different contests. And one of the contests was that a publisher would read it. And it was a small press. And they read it and then they ended up contracting it. So that worked out well for me.
Right. So that's interesting. You and you mentioned contests several times. So you're always going the contest route rather than like, let me find an agent. Let me go through that whole process.
Yeah. In fact, some of the first contests I entered were through Writer's Digest. I think at the time I didn't realize like you were supposed to do like get the agent,
right.
editor. I was like, oh, you enter contests. That's how you get these things.
Right. No, but that's great. That's great for listeners to hear too, is that there's not just one way. I mean, a lot of people talk about, you know, going the agent route versus going the self-publishing route, but you know, there are other ways to get to that end, and there's a lot of presses out there. Granted, there's a lot of small presses out there, but that's a great place to start. I mean, you can always build from there, and there's a lot of small presses that are fantastic. So that's a good feeling that your first book comes out. You're like, wow, this is like real. Now, when that book came out, had you already made that decision of like, I am just going to do this now?
Yeah, I did. And I just started writing like a maniac. And I was doing a lot of like novella type length books. And so I think within the first 3 years, I had published, like contracted with 3 different small presses at that point and had like four books a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you were being very efficient.
Yes.
Was that difficult to do?
Because that's like part of my like personality.
That's just who you
I do. Like that's how I do.
You're just like, you know, I'm writing 4,000 words today. I don't care.
Yes.
That's impressive because it's physically exhausting.
It is.
And
it catches up with you.
It does. Like what now, you know, and I'm always curious about the business side of things too, because I talk about that a lot. You know, making a decision to leave a professional career and to become a writer, even a successful writer, is oftentimes not lucrative. Were you feeling like pressure and stress along the way?
A little bit. So when I was working, I was also paying for daycare, and anyone who's ever paid for daycare and works for a nonprofit,
it just nets at you. Nets out, right?
Yeah. I was like, yeah, exactly, just breaking even. So that really wasn't that much, but I did want to have some money to be able to pay for the stuff that I was doing with writing. And so I actually was freelance writing on the side, like health articles and whatever I could find, like in little magazines or online magazines. I was writing articles for that. So
right, and the other benefit is you're just writing everything off.
Yes, exactly.
As part of it. Yeah, my Netflix.
And no more Dave here. I was at home, and
right,
they could run around like little maniacs while I was on the computer. So
right. Yeah, it's a weird thing to be writing full time and to, So for example, like I don't even read during the day because I feel like
same.
Even though I know I'm not going to like write until 5 o'clock, I still feel guilty reading because I'm like I should be writing. I should be doing other stuff writing related, whether it's social media stuff, whatever it is. And after a while, you realize that adds up to a lot of things. Like there's a lot of that you have to do besides just writing the book.
Yeah.
So you were doing for a while a fair amount of historical romance / historical fiction.
Yeah.
And I always find that, people never set out and say like, okay, I'm going to write this book. Now I got to do a lot of research. I really feel like people who almost like, I can't wait to research. So let me figure out what book I'm going to write about so I can research. Because I'm the opposite. I hate research. So I do as little as possible. But so now you're under contract for several books, writing several books a year. Where is this all leading to?
I don't know, because I never plan to retire. So I feel like it's just sort of like leading to forever.
But are you feeling like I want to continue within this realm? So I know the book coming out is not romance, correct?
Right. Yeah. It's historical fiction. Yeah.
So what was the kind of the decision making behind that? Or was just like, this is a story I want to tell?
So I had been doing research on another book. And I was reading all these letters about between these sisters. I wrote a book about Nancy Mitford called The Mayfair Bookshop. And there's thousands of letters. They were hugely prolific in their letter writing, and their letters have been published. So while I was reading one of them, Nancy Mitford mentioned that there was this woman named Deli who was, hysterical, and she was making comments about all the bright young things, which were sort of like the bohemian people of the 1920s that were sort of running around like drunk and partying all the time. And she was saying, all this free loving is amazing. And I was like, well, who's this person? She does sound funny. And when I scrolled down to the bottom, it said that Deli was Adele Astaire's sister to Fred Astaire. And I did not even know that Fred Astaire had a sister. So my brain, right? Like my brain was like, wait, what? And also, what is his sister doing in London having lunch with aristocrats? That's bizarre.
Right.
So I found out that she and Fred had actually made their debut in London in the 1920s, and they were hugely popular not only here in the US on Broadway, but in London's West End theater world as well. In fact, she dated a prince, which is hilarious. And I just couldn't stop reading about her. She ended up marrying the son of a duke. She was a funny person and a huge star in her own right at the time. People thought she was better than her brother, which is crazy because now you only ever hear about Fred Astaire. Right. And so when I just spent like 2 or 3 days buried deep inside the research den on that, I couldn't like stop thinking about her, and I wanted to write her story because I just thought it was so cool and interesting, and I wanted to bring her back to life for other people because she was a person I feel like should be remembered and wasn't.
Right. So now you're making a leap. I mean, granted, you're writing historical romance, so the research, the line that you have to walk between accuracy and story, you have experience in that. But this feels like, I don't know. To me, any kind of historical fiction, I'm so impressed with, because to me it seems like such a monumental task. Was it a different process writing this book? Writing at the pace, I assume that you were writing the other books.
Yeah, it is totally a different pace. For example, with romance, I could write 3,000-4,000 words a day. On some days I had to write like 7 if I was, behind on a deadline or something. Yeah, it's insane. But with historical fiction, I find that 1,500 is like really the max I can do, especially because I do have to stop a lot and do research to make sure that I'm getting something right, because it's about like this biographical fiction is about a real person. So you want to make sure that you're doing them justice for their memory. And at the same time, it's kind of hard to figure out how to include those facts, but also make it fiction, because it is still fiction and there is like the character arc, and you want to make it fun for a reader, not like they're reading a textbook or a memoir or an actual biography. You know, you want it to be a story. So
that is there a responsibility there, like an actual responsibility there in terms of like, okay, this has to get a sign off from the family or anything like that?
No, because it's fiction.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like I need to contact any of the family, but at the same time, I want to make sure that I do respect her memory. So,
Sure.
You know, I'm not writing anything that's super disrespectful or anything like that.
Now, was this, and as you're writing this book, or as you finish this book, was this ultimately going to the same publisher as some of your previous books, or?
Yes. Yeah. So it was an option book for me that my editor liked. So it went with William Morrow.
Got it. So they knew that it was a little bit of a departure from what you had written before.
From the romance, absolutely, yeah. But I had written a biographical fiction before, so there was still like some, like, they knew that I could write that.
Yeah. Well, that's very exciting. And then, do you feel like you want to kind of continue in that realm? Are you ever going to go back to thrillers? You know,
that is a great question. So my next pitch is actually a historical thriller. I'm waiting to hear back because it is a departure from what I'm doing. I love the biographical fiction, and I really, really have enjoyed doing that so much, but it is a lot of work. And my brain is sort of telling me that it needs a little bit more of an adventure. So I'm hoping that I get to write the next one.
And that's just because you're just waiting to hear back if the publisher says that's something that we would acquire, as opposed to like, well, I'm going to write this anyway, and I'll see who's going to take it.
Well, that's kind of like my plan. Yeah, I do have 2 more books that I already finished and contracted with them that come out next year. And one of them is also a little bit of a departure. I was able to convince my editor to let me write from the point of view of a dog. So they know that there's like some things I'm exploring, I think.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's point of view is tricky at best in whatever the circumstances. But if you nail it, if you nail that voice, it can be like highly compelling.
I think I did, just because she wrote me like all caps, like, wow, this was so good and it made me cry. So I think I did.
Wow. That's fantastic. Well, readers love dogs. Readers really love cats. But if there's an animal, and I've learned from the hard way not to kill a dog.
Oh yeah, don't do that.
Yeah, I did that.
I ended the book before that happened.
Okay. Okay, that's good. Yeah, I had and I've told this story before, but I killed a dog in one of my books, and the dog, you don't know who the dog, you've never heard of this dog before. It's just 2 cops saying, "Hey, we found a dead dog, and it looked like it had been murdered," basically.
Yeah.
You don't see it happen. And then Goodreads, like all the trigger warnings, animal torture and cruelty. I'm like, what?
Yeah. I have a book that came out in 2014, and it's about Queen Elizabeth I's cousin. And in real life, her dog was run over by a wagon. And I guess the problem was that I had developed this like, since it was a puppy, and it was like her favorite dog. And so it had a lot of page time, and then it died. And I got the same thing on Goodreads. Like, how could you do that? I'm like, well, it actually happened. Like, it was a fact.
Right.
Never do that again.
And I'm sure you didn't go into the grisly detail.
No.
Oh man. Yeah. It's funny. And then what happens is, not only do people post trigger warnings, but then you get all these commenters say, "Oh, thank you. I will not only never read this book, I'll never read anything by this author."
Yes.
And you're like, wow. But then in my next book, I could kill like an orphanage, like everyone in the orphanage. Okay. They're like, "Oh, that's cool. That's a thriller."
That happens. Yeah. Totally natural, but don't you dare touch that dog.
People are weird. So now that, it's rare that I talk to somebody who says, I'm just going to become a writer. And then it worked. So at this point in your career, and I know it's a never ending career and you can't picture yourself not ever writing because I feel the same way.
Yeah.
But are you at a place where you're like, yeah, this is kind of what I expected it to be?
I think now I am, but back in 2008, definitely not. I got my first royalty check back then, and it was before, they sent you stuff through email. So I got the check in the mail, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be so great. I'm going to be able to go on a vacation. And I opened it up and I was like, oh my gosh, I guess we can all go to Starbucks and get a black coffee, no fillers, nothing. That's it. Yep. And now it's actually a full-time job for me. So I'm living the dream now, but back then I wasn't, and it was a long and arduous hill to climb.
Right. And you're living the dream as a professional author, but it's also so you have some people who win the lottery, right? And they have a book that and they might not ever be able to follow it up again, but they have the mega best-selling book. Then you have other authors who just chip away. And that's kind of the category I fall in. And you gradually get bigger, and maybe you get a little smaller and then you get bigger again. But there's a lot of balls in the air.
Always.
Constantly. And so it's not like you're just writing a couple pages and then having your daiquiri on your yacht.
Right. That's actually the new dream, right?
Right.
Take some days off and just go, not have to check social media. That would be amazing.
Right. It is it's surprising all the different machinations of what an author, a professional author, actually has to do. I mean, I'm supplementing income by running a retreat and doing and it's it's a lot of, it's great and it's a lot of fun, but people have this image of oh, you just go to the cabin behind your house for a few hours and pound away on a typewriter. I'm like, no. More
than half of the job is not doing the job. Half of my day is the business of writing versus actually writing. Right. I host 2 podcasts, and then I have all my social media and, your newsletter and even just, the accounting part of it. I don't have a bookkeeper in my office that's keeping track of all that stuff. And then, literally it could take 12 hours of the day and maybe 2 or 3 of those are actually writing.
Right. And a lot of those things make nothing. So let's talk about podcasts for a second. Podcasts, generally speaking, you lose money because I pay to have this produced and actually edited and all that kind of stuff. And I set out to do it, not oh, okay, I'm going to make money. No, I set out to do it because I'm I want to meet other writers.
Right.
And people are interesting to me. And I want to ask people the questions that I never get asked. I'm sick of questions about what literary hero of mine would I want to have dinner with? I want to dig into people's lives. But then the benefit of it after a while, you're I know a lot of writers. I know a lot of interesting people. What was your intentions for starting 2 podcasts?
So they're both very different. One of them is called History, Books, and Wine. And that is just combining 3 of my favorite things: getting to talk about history, getting to talk about books, and drinking different wine.
Right.
And on that podcast, I have a co-host, so we get to chat together during our little happy hours. And then we also, the same as you, bring on different authors that we can chat with about all 3 of those things and just have a good time. And I really like that one. It was really just a passion project to try it, and then people really like it, so we kept that going. And then the other one that I do is called Crime Feast, which is not a book podcast at all. It's actually just a true crime podcast, and every week we bring up a new case that we've researched and found interesting, or we want to share a message or something like that with true crime lovers.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously that stuff is very popular, but I'm sure you didn't set out doing that saying people will love this. I'm sure you set out saying I will love this.
Yes. I'm like, this is awesome. I get to basically like talk with my friends every single week about, because there's three of us that do that one together, talk to my friends every week about different cases, which we were doing anyway. So now we get to sort of, chat and have a good time and then share that with other people.
Yeah, and I think in all of that is very meaningful and valid advice about intention, right? Like same thing with writing. Like, if you decide to have the intention of I'm going to become a writer and I'm going to make money, then you're doing it all wrong.
Right.
If you're saying I'm going to write because this is my passion and I can't not do this, then good things will happen if you don't focus on the good things.
Yes, exactly.
And if you're willing to share and be vulnerable and do all the things that you do, but it's because a lot of people do get into writing for the wrong reason.
I think so too. And they get really disappointed too. I've talked to a lot of new writers because I do a lot of mentoring, and, they do sort of a lot of times step into it thinking like, I'm going to be like a millionaire. I'm going to have that yacht and then be, just living the life. And it's a lot more drudgery than that, especially at first.
Do you think, I've gotten this question before and I never quite know how to answer it, but I'm curious now just based on what you're saying. Do you think you have to have talent to be a writer? Or do you think you could be, because we're all better than we were, right?
Yeah.
When we started out. But there's also, I think, a natural talent to a lot of us that allows us to get really decent.
Yeah.
Do you think you have to have that, or do you think any writer can sit down and learn to get better and become, publisher?
I think it's a combination. So I think most people that want to write books have a natural storytelling ability, or at least a love of storytelling. And so knowing that, I think, is enough, because you can learn how to write. I wasn't born knowing how to write. You yourself also said, like, you didn't know how to write. Like, you can learn that stuff, and you can learn what is compelling in a story, and you can learn how to, develop characters, and you can learn how to not tell and how to show instead, and how to, evoke emotion from your reader. Those are all things I think that are learnable. And then there's like the innate storytelling thing where you have like a really cool idea that's actually interesting and people want to know what that idea is. That saying that, I actually have a friend who had never thought about writing in her life, didn't even start reading till she was an adult, and then was like, I wonder if I could write. And then she's a writer now. She's published many books. So I don't know. Like, I think maybe even she probably had some sort of love of story in the brain.
Right. There's an intuition that I think there's intuition and empathy.
Yeah.
That I think the better writers have, and you learn a lot through rejection. You learn a lot through your critique groups, agents and editors, and all the rejection slips that you get, as opposed to necessarily just taking classes. But I do think, the better writers get to a point where they can look at something and be like, this isn't interesting, or this is what this is about, and this is what makes it interesting, that I don't think you can really teach. I think it's developed over time.
Yeah.
But I think it's innate in them.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
Well, good stuff. Well, listen, I'm going to let you go in a minute, but before we do, we got a little storytelling to do. Speaking of natural ability.
Hopefully I don't freeze.
Oh, this is always a shit show. So it's always fun, and it's only going to last a couple minutes. I don't know why I'm describing it like you're at the dentist. Hopefully it's not like that. But I'm going to pick a random book off of my bookshelves. We're going to pick a random page, and then I'm going to choose a sentence. I'm going to read that sentence, and then that's going to be the first sentence of a very short story. So I'll read that sentence. You give me a couple, I do a couple, and I'll call it quits in a couple minutes. But give me a color of a book.
Red.
Oh, okay. All right, an oldie but a goodie. Grisham's The Rainmaker. So
I haven't read that one.
Yeah, I did years ago. Wow, these are long books. I don't remember Grisham writing 600 pages, but maybe this was earlier. That was more of the era, I guess.
Yeah.
So give me a page between 1 and 600.
Let's do 437.
It's a good one. All right, I'm going to quickly scan the beginning of a chapter. Very legally, no surprise.
Oh my God. I know nothing about legal stuff.
We can take this in.
We're gonna wing it.
Okay, here we go. Every time I pick up my office phone, I can see this well-dressed, perfectly groomed, and highly respected thug listening to my conversation.
He's standing outside of the window, staring in at me. It's really creepy.
I know the best thing to do is to not engage, and eventually he'll tire and leave me alone. But it's been 28 days straight that he's been there. And even though he's much bigger than I am, today's the day I snap.
I run outside of the door and I take the tent that he's been living in and I shred it with my scissors. I toss the poles into the street and I tell him he's got to leave right now.
I expect him to charge me, and I'm preparing for it. I press all of my weight in my back leg and assume a slight crouch, and I put my fists up. But to my surprise, he just looks at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen and said, "That was my only home."
And then I said, "I'm really sorry, son, but I told you that you needed to get a job, and it's been too long that you're just camping out on my front lawn. You need to leave."
But at that moment, those sad eyes turned into something else. Could it be fury? Hard to say. But it becomes more clear when he reaches into the pocket of his extra large jeans and pulls out a knife.
I see the knife and it's long and sharp, and I think, wow, he might stab me, or I can invite him inside and we can start chopping some vegetables for a salad.
Okay, we're going to call it there. I love the idea that they end up making salad together. There's a metaphor in there somewhere.
This is a really broken relationship.
I like how I take it dark. You're like, no, they're gonna eat healthy together.
You know, that is like one thing one of my really good friends says to me all the time when she's reading my book. She's like, "You need to be meaner. You're too nice in this scene. Get meaner." And so then I have to change it because I'm like, no, we should just like all come inside. We'll make a great meal, have some wine. It'll be a great time.
But there is something very, there's a salve for saying, I'm going to just write from a very aggressive and maybe brutal point of view.
Mhm.
And it's true to the character, but it also kind of just feels like, wow, I just made this character do something I would never do, but
Right.
it felt good.
Absolutely.
Except for killing a dog. Don't kill the
Yeah, I will never kill a dog again. I literally will never do that.
Well, listen, what a pleasure talking to you today. And
It was a lot of fun.
and congrats on the upcoming release. It sounds
Thank you so
amazing.
much.
So,
Thank you so much. I'm really excited.
all right, take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye. So that's it. That's my conversation with Eliza Knight. Fascinating to talk to. Her new book, Starring Adele Astaire, is not coming out until a couple weeks from when I'm recording this, but I'm assuming it's out now, so go check it out. Help it fly off the shelves. She probably needs no help doing that. If you want to learn more about Eliza, I encourage you to go to her website, which is elizaknight.com. And if you want to find out more about me, if you want to read about my books or check out my appearances or look at the information about my upcoming writing retreat, just go to my website, carterwilson.com. As always, thank you, listeners and viewers. I appreciate the fact that you're tuning into this. It means a lot to me. More episodes of Making It Out coming out very soon. In the meantime, take care.